I've spent the last 2 days watching colleagues and friends present on their favourite hobbies, and I'm going to be absolutely no exception at all. I'm going to talk about my favourite hobby and interest in research, which is hyperbaric medicine. I would love, as Igor has just said, to give you a full review of everything hyperbaric, but we only have 24 minutes, so I'm going to summarise some of the interest that I have in hyperbaric medicine and some of what I think is currently interesting in terms of diving physiology. We've heard a little bit this morning about free divers and breath hold divers. What I'm going to talk about today are these chaps, open circuit scuba divers or closed circuit rebreather divers. The difference, of course, between a breath hold diver and a rebreather or scuba diver is they breathe gas at ambient pressure throughout their dive and are therefore subject to various physiological challenges associated with gases under pressure. The unique thing about rebreather diving, and I don't think Jim is still here, so I can challenge him on this being a unique feature. With rebreather diving, you can expose yourself in a relatively short period of time to hypo and hyperbaria, capnia, oxia, and temperature. And it's quite a scary thing when you experience one or two of those things simultaneously, but that's for this afternoon's presentations on cross-adaptation and global warming. I'm going to talk really about some of the fundamentals of diving physiology and how they interest me. So just a quick recap. This screen is huge, so I'm going to stand over here. A quick recap of diving interest just in the UK, and these are numbers taken from various diving agencies that are happy to release the statistics. There are around 230,000 active qualified divers of all grades in the UK as we speak, and then decreasing numbers all the way down to the low 100s with military divers. And all of these people are exposing themselves to hyperbaric environment on a regular basis, including chamber crew, the unbenders, the people that treat diving disorders, and of course tunnelers who work down mines under high pressure. I don't need to introduce you to the underwater environment. We've just had a superb presentation from Mike and others over the last couple of days about the stresses involved in entering water or entering strange environments. But just to remind us of what we're facing while diving, there are sensory problems. Color disappears, and if you rely on color for understanding of signals or communication, that's a problem. Your hearing becomes impaired, so obviously oral communication underwater becomes almost impossible. And the diving environment itself poses thermal stresses. There are entrapment and envenomation risks. Obviously, there's a huge likelihood of user error for the untrained individual. But the main problem that I'm mostly interested in is the effect of pressure, the effect of immersion pressure on the body, and the effect of breathing gases under pressure. And those gas and pressure-related problems can be loosely divided into two tranches of pathology. The barotraumas, so injury invoked by a change in pressure, either a change positively or a change negatively, and the dissolved gas disorders, so the problems associated with solubilized gas in body tissues. Diving is inherently quite safe. I say that reservedly, having still been able to stand and talk about it. And as Mike said earlier, the majority of divers that are killed while diving die from drowning. They don't die from arterial gas embolism caused by pulmonary barotrauma. They don't tend to die from cardiac disorders. Decompression sickness is incredibly low on the death rate, and obviously trauma is always a problem, especially related to deep diving and entrapment. In fact, death rates during diving, both recreational diving, is about the same as motor vehicle accidents or jogging. And the next statistics do not relate to motor accidents and jogging, but relate to diving. If you were to go diving in Australia, you're about 0.57 in 100,000 divers end up having incidents that result in death. And in the Orkney Isles in Scotland, that increases to around 4 in 100,000. And that's not because Scottish diving is necessarily more physiologically challenging than diving in Australia, but certainly cold and deep water are factors when it comes to incidents while diving. But that's not physiology, that's just people dying from diving-related injuries. Let's talk a little bit about the physiology and the physics related to diving. I'm unashamedly showing you lots of photographs in this presentation, as everyone else has. And most of these are taken by me. This is my friend Steve with a little bag of scallops here, having done some diving in the Shetland Isles with me a few years ago. The big problems are with depth and pressure. And just to remind you all, for those of you who forgot what the physics of depth and pressure are, for every 10 meters you go underwater, the atmospheric pressure around you, or the ambient pressure, increases by 1 whole atmosphere. So for every 10 meters of seawater, you double, for the first 10 meters, you double the pressure you're exerted to, and for every 10 meters under that, it then goes up exponentially. We've then got the breathing gases we have to worry about. Recreational divers, on the whole, tend to use nitrogen-based mixtures, air being the most common form of diving gas, although we are now, even in recreational diving, moving towards nitrogen and helium-based mixtures, although helium's just rocketed up in price, so I expect that may well change very shortly. And all of the effects of breathing gases are because of their increased partial pressure, and of course the partial pressure of each of your breathing gases will increase as you increase in depth. And just to remind you again, while you're diving on a SCUBA or on a rebreathing unit, you are breathing gas at the ambient pressure around you. So just a quick maths reminder, if you're at 10 meters, the ambient pressure is 2 atmospheres, therefore the partial pressure of nitrogen is 0.79 times 2. That's 1.4 something for those who want to do the maths. Gas solubility is the big problem, and gases that you breathe in are all soluble in your tissue. If they weren't, you wouldn't be able to respire. Obviously, oxygen and nitrogen enter your body, and there are differential solubilities in different tissues. So there are things called fast tissues, things called slow tissues, and that normally depends upon the oxygen or the blood delivery to that tissue, and also the solubility constant of that gas in that tissue. And of course, we don't just have soft tissue and hard tissue in our bodies. We have a whole range of different tissues, and each one of those will have a different solubility constant for each of the different gases that you're breathing, which makes trying to model this almost impossible. But people have done a pretty good job of trying over the years. And of course, the effects of these dissolved gases have various effects on systems. The peripheral and central nervous system is the main target for oxygen and nitrogen while diving, although there are some pulmonary effects, and those who work in ITU will know a lot about the pulmonary effects. We were told about them yesterday of high oxygen partial pressures. But when you're diving, you're not really on high oxygen for 15 hours or so. With saturation diving, that could be a problem, but certainly for recreational diving, we don't tend to see many pulmonary problems simply because of the time course. So let's just remind ourselves of the physiology of immersion. And while we're looking at this, we must remind ourselves that divers don't tend to expose themselves intentionally to cold water without wearing some kind of protection. This is a lovely photograph of somebody in the Farne Isles with some seals, and you can see here this lady is wearing a dry suit. She's covering her face to protect any heat loss. She's protecting herself against the diving reflex by wearing a face mask, and obviously gloves. Dry suits are the norm in UK diving in cold waters. So although we do see a cold water immersion response, if you jump into cold water wearing a wetsuit or a pair of swimming trunks, you don't tend to see as much wearing a full immersion suit or a diving suit. The long-term effects of cold water immersion will affect divers, and everything we talk about in terms of gas solubility, saturation, and decompression, we must take into account that a lot of those events happen towards the end of a dive, where you are possibly colder than you were when you jumped into the water. So there is a slight risk of hypothermia in diving, although again that is mitigated mainly against the duration of dives. We don't tend to spend so long in the water because of the gas problems. And of course, there is the diving response to consider, and we've heard about that already this morning. And that isn't really a problem when it comes to diving, because on the whole, we tend to be wearing a face mask, and we don't see much bradycardia in diving. I've worn Holter monitors while diving, and I've never noticed my heart rate drop during a dive. Even when I've taken my mask off, on the whole, you don't seem to see a particularly large diving response. The main problem with immersion, relating to what Mike has talked about and others have talked about, is the problem with just being in the water. And immersion fluid shift is emerging as a really big problem when it comes to diving. If we immerse ourselves in water, as we know, we get an increase in venous return, and our central blood volume increases by up to 500 milliliters. We get a decrease in lung volumes during breath hold. We've heard about breath hold already this morning, and less so when using SCUBA, because of course you're fully inflating your lungs when you breathe in and breathe out at ambient pressure. But you do get an increase in stroke volume and cardiac output, around 20% increase, because of that increase in central blood volume. This elicits the body's response to pressure overload. We heard about that in astronauts. And you get an increased diuresis, increased production of urine. And on the whole, if you are normally hydrated and you go for a dive, if you don't need a wee after about 45 minutes, you're not normally hydrated. I normally get my students to stand up and give me the honesty test about peeing in swimming pools, but I'll save you from that today. Because of this, we see an increase in right atrial and pulmonary artery pressure, and it can go up under normal circumstances by 15 to 20 millimeters of mercury. And this has been measured in divers regularly. So we know that when you're immersed in water, either swimming, diving, and we'll talk about triathlons in a minute, we see an increase in pulmonary artery pressure by 15 to 20 millimeters of mercury. For those who are interested in pulmonary physiology, pulmonary physicians, etc., will know that this is approaching a critical phase when it comes to pulmonary artery pressure. There is a risk of pulmonary overpressure and a risk of pulmonary edema. And in fact, it is immersion pulmonary edema that in the last 5 or so years, although it was discovered in the late 80s and first described by Peter Wilmshurst, it's been becoming more and more important in terms of our diving and understanding of diving-related injuries. It's a significant cause of morbidity and, in fact, mortality in divers, and its statistics published in a review paper a few years ago expected around 1% of scuba divers are affected by it. Around 1.5% of triathletes are affected by it, so maybe that explains some of the unexplained deaths in triathlons as well. And up to 25% of elite free divers also have been shown to suffer from immersion pulmonary edema. It's a difficult thing to diagnose because the subject in terms of diving tends to get affected while at depth because that's when they're going to be compressed. So we get pulmonary edema occurring, and this little figure up here is from Peter's work showing a normal lung and a edematous lung. And you end up essentially when the alveolar membrane pressure exceeds the plasma pressure, you end up with a 25 millimeter-ish gradient. You end up with pulmonary edema, water filling into the alveolar. Of course, this is a hydrostatic pulmonary edema. There are other forms of pulmonary edema caused by infection, caused by other problems, and they are slightly different in their effects. But the actual generalization is that you end up with a buildup of fluid in your air sacs. If you're sat in your chair here in front of me, this isn't a big problem. We can ventilate you. We can sort you out. If you're 50 meters underwater, just starting in a long ascent, this could be a big problem. I won't go through this rather complicated flow diagram, but just to point out what some of the exacerbating factors are in our understanding of pulmonary edema. We know that hyperhydration, remember what I said about divers needing a wee after 45 minutes? Divers don't tend to hyperhydrate. It's not something we like to do because then you need a wee after about 25 minutes and it gets awfully uncomfortable when you're wearing your dry suit and you haven't catheterized yourself. So hyperhydration doesn't tend to be a problem. But in hot countries, and about 4 years ago, there was a case of pulmonary edema in a diver in Gozo, which caused a lot of bad press for the diving industry. He was definitely hyperhydrated. It was a hot country, told to drink lots of water, drank lots of water, went diving with a slightly increased systolic blood pressure to start with. Exertion, of course, raises your blood pressure. Cold-induced vasoconstriction exacerbates the central blood pooling and the resulting hypertension. And of course, increased gas density at depth, for those of you who are paying attention with the pulmonary pressure gradients, will increase your pulmonary pressure gradient because you're having to suck a little bit harder to get gas into your lungs while you dive. So work of breathing can be a big problem. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. As I said, it affects divers during a dive. I do a lot of diving, and quite often I feel a little bit short of breath because I'm chasing something or trying to get out of a hole or having a moment. So it's difficult to diagnose while you're diving. And when you're diving on a rebreather, every time you feel short of breath, you think, oh my God, I've got a hypercapnic hit, I've got hypoxia, I'm going to die. You don't think about pulmonary edema. And certainly scuba divers, if you watch your buddies breathing, how often do you sit there and go, that's one breath, that's two breaths? You don't notice these things. Pulmonary congestion is the symptom. Shortness of breath is how you see it. And of course, when you start to ascend at the end of a dive, your PO2 starts to plummet because you've no longer got very good gas transfer across your lungs. Remember, partial pressures drives respiration, while at depth, you're breathing a PO2 of 1 point something. That's brilliant. It doesn't matter if you've got a bit of pulmonary congestion when you've got a PO2 of 1 point something in your alveolar. As soon as you start to come to the surface and the PO2 starts to drop because of the ambient pressure dropping, you end up being unconscious and dying. And I suspect, and I think the general consensus is that the 70-something% of people dying of drowning while diving might well have a large proportion of people actually dying of drowning because of pulmonary edema on ascent. Just because it's now been published, everyone's looking for it, and of course pathologists are now looking for it in their pathology, and this is a a subject with some pulmonary edema. So of course, worker breathing, as I said, is a key element. And these are classic images which I've reproduced from a paper published a very long time ago. And these are looking at the centroids, in other words, the kind of the center of gravity of pressure when it comes to lungs and your breathing apparatus. And these are typical scuba diver profiles, somebody swimming up, somebody swimming down. And if you look at the distance between the two centroids, where the gas comes in and where the gas needs to go, you'll see that it's variable on a dive. And those of you who've done scuba diving, you don't tend to spend the whole time horizontal or vertical or anywhere. You're just going to swim around and have fun. So there isn't really any constant gradient driving the pulmonary overpressure. People like me who dive on closed-circuit rebreathers tend to dive horizontally because you're paranoid about losing your buoyancy control. And with closed-circuit rebreathers, your counterlung, the source of gas which you're breathing in, is either on your back or on your front throughout the dive. So you can see for those of us with front-mounted counterlungs, we have a positive pressure in relation to our lungs. That's great. That makes breathing in really easy. Open your mouth, air comes in, breathe out. No pulmonary overpressure problems. If you've got a rear-mounted counterlung, you have to suck quite hard to get gas into your lungs. And it's no surprise that information recently published from the French Navy divers, hard to get information out of Navy divers as we all know, but we got some information here. Over the last 40 years, they have admitted to 11 Navy divers suffering from immersion pulmonary edema quite badly with back-mounted counterlungs, only one with a rebreather with a front-mounted counterlung. So there's certainly evidence, probably due to negative pressure breathing. There are two current treatments, and I always like this. The mountaineers tell us there's a couple of really good treatments that they give everyone. Nifedipine, calcium channel blocker, it does something to blood pressure in the pulmonary artery, as we know, and that can protect those who are susceptible. And of course, sildenafil gets everywhere. They're also trialing that. The problem is with sildenafil, it has other effects, not the effect you're thinking about. It has other effects on decompression sickness and exacerbates decompression sickness symptoms. So you don't really want to be taking this if you're going diving, and it's resulted in some interesting outcomes. The work really concentrating on this at the moment is in triathletes and swimmers. Heather just told us about her monumental swim, and it's people like that that are doing long immersions and long swims that might well benefit from this. So tissue saturation, as I said, is variable depending on tissue type. Here is a classic modeled tissue saturation curve. It is rather complicated, but just look that everything's heading upwards to a plateau during a dive. So different tissues here, indicated by these different lines, are saturating at different rates with the gases that you are breathing in. And during that dive, the partial pressure increase due to depth is increasing the ontake of those gases and the saturation of those gases in tissue. And as I said before, it's an exponential depending on number of circulations and duration and depth and pressure. It's dependent upon the tissue solubility and the blood delivery. Of course, that is then affected by exercise, cold, and the other factors that we've looked at already this week. And as I said, most recreational gases contain nitrogen and oxygen. Oxygen has acute toxic effects with partial pressures greater than about 1.6 atmospheres and chronic effects of partial pressures greater than about 0.3, 0.4 atmospheres. But again, as I said, SCUBA don't spend so long in the water that they suffer from that. And I'm not going to spend any time at all talking about oxygen toxicity because we try and mitigate against it at all costs while diving because of its acute effect and effect of drowning. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly about inert gas narcosis, which is one of my little pet loves. Many gases, as we know, are mild anesthetics. There's a little list of them here, which we've related to nitrogen, which is our gas of interest when it comes to diving. And you can see here that down the bottom we've got nitrous oxide. We know that's an anesthetic. That's what we use it for. But did you know that xenon is an anesthetic, almost as potent as nitrous oxide? I can see you all now going outside and finding xenon lamps and trying to sniff them. But it's a very potent anesthetic. Krypton, argon, they're all anesthetics to various degrees. And of course, dependent upon their partial pressure, they will cause an anesthetic effect. Narcosis affects divers from around about 15 to 20 meters and downwards. So that's of partial pressures of around 1.7 in nitrogen and beyond, and is a variable effect. There are some divers I know that can dive to 60 meters on air and not have a single problem, they claim, and other divers that are off there at about 15 meters and unable to focus. You get similar effects to alcohol, but without the hangover. So Mike's schematic is no longer affecting us when we're diving. As I said, it's directly related to partial pressure and therefore depth. and is increased when your PCO2 is high. So while exercising, especially on a rebreathing circuit where your PCO2 starts to rise a bit when you're working and energetically consuming oxygen, the effects of narcosis are increased. So a panic starts to set in and then it all gets even worse. So it's something we need to consider. We know also that the depth, and I would assume narcotic effect of air dives, is associated with increased risk of incidents. And I analysed the British Subaqueous Club incident report data from about 9 years, and the data shows that it's around 83% of injuries were reported on dives that were going deeper than 30 meters, and a very small number shallower than 30 meters. I excluded from the data set all those people that drowned on the surface, because they'd never actually got down to depth to suffer. And of course, that number goes over here, because a lot more people die, unfortunately, on the surface, either before or after they've been diving. But from the diving data, certainly supports that narcosis is a big problem. We have studied narcosis in chambers. Here's some of my students in the hyperbaric chamber in London, which sadly closed 2 months ago. This is something we're hearing quite a lot of. We were told that the kinetic centrifuge the other day had closed following a study that we did there. We've now done studies here and that's closing. So anyone wants to collaborate with me, I can guarantee your lab will shut down within 2 years. So these are some data we've done some other studies, but this is just a simple Stroop test data with this bunch of students. And we can see that at 6 atmospheres at 50 meters in a simulated dive, the Stroop test speed, the time it takes them to read off the names of the colors of the words that appear in front of them, is significantly increased, just showing that there is some narcotic effect and an effect on concentration. Unlike altitude, temperature responses, there are no known adaptations in man. You can't go and do this every morning and get better at it. You're always going to get narcotic. If that was the case, anesthetics, you'd have to have a larger and larger dose every time you went for a surgery, and that's just not something that happens. There is some temporary acclimatization if you keep doing it, and that's probably a memory effect, rather like the I can always drive home drunk until somebody puts a skip outside your house, then you crash into it. So as long as you've done a repeated task, and if those of you who have learned to dive will know we do the same thing over and over and over again until you can do it with your eyes shut. The mechanism is really not clear. I think it's one of those things that somebody, if they actually understood how it worked, would probably win a Nobel Prize in physiology for it. But we believe, and the best evidence we've got is this recent paper here from a group in China that did some really elegant modeling. Each of these little blue dots is a nitrogen molecule, and they exposed a model, a computer-generated model, and looked at the solubility of nitrogen in aqueous and non-aqueous tissues, and they looked at a membrane here. This is a model neurological membrane with the membrane space here, and you can see the little nitrogen molecules are happy solubilizing here until you expose them to pressure, and they all zip into the center of the membrane. And if you take away the nitrogen molecules and look at the space now inside the membrane, this membrane has become wider. And electron microscopy of tissues under high pressure have shown that this widening of the membrane is evident. And I think we're going to hear about HPNS shortly after this. So the last thing I'm going to talk about very briefly, because I've just had a finger waved at me, is decompression. We heard about Haldane earlier. He spent a lot of time bending goats and came up with some really intelligent data about decompression. There are lots of understanding about gas bubble formation, and this example for some beer clearly shows that gas bubble formation is dependent upon a number of factors. This was the same beer, just put in 2 different glasses. Decompression is associated with the generation of bubbles. It's well known. When you decompress, you still take on some gas onto some of your slower tissues, but your faster tissues, the tissues that are very good at solubilizing gas, tend to dump gas quite quickly. And there are multiple theories of bubble formation, including some recent papers showing some really elegant models of bubble formation in an ex vivo system, showing that fat and muscle have differential abilities to form gas bubbles on them. And of course, bubbles are subject to Boyle's law and ascent. So as you come up out of your dive, these bubbles get bigger and start to cause problems, which we manifest as decompression sickness. We can detect these bubbles using Doppler ultrasound. Here is a right ventricle and a left ventricle showing bubbles in the right ventricle side. This is good news. The right ventricle then pumps those bubbles to the lungs. They're then cleared through the lung filter. And they're normally always formed on the venous side. And numbers correlate with decompression rate. You can see here the red line is a rapid ascent, the blue line is a slow ascent, and there are significantly more bubbles formed. Bubbles are scored using this rather simple scoring system ranging from no bubbles to lots of bubbles. And most models, this is an animal model, most models in humans and animals use the same bubble score. And the more bubbles you get, the more higher the bubble grade you get, the more risk you get of getting decompression sicknesses. We only get about 1,000 hospitalizations a year in the UK from decompression sickness. So out of the 230,000 divers, that's not a huge risk, but it certainly is a risk we need to consider. This is something that's cropped up before, and I'm obviously interested in this. I like looking at error bars and seeing how big they are on studies like this. This is the variability, interpersonal variability of a study of divers doing the same dive over and over again. And you can see here that there is a very vast degree of variability. And something we've heard already this week from our thermal colleagues and our altitude colleagues is you cannot predict when a bubble is going to form. It's very hard to say, on this dive, you are going to get excess bubbles, you're going to generate symptoms. And heterogeneity among the population, probably due to hydration, maybe thermal comfort, your exercise, state of mind, previous exposures. These have all been cited in the literature of being factors that might influence bubble formation. Therefore, it's incredibly hard to predict with algorithms. So those of you, like me, who put a computer on your wrist and dump in the sea and expect it to work, be very wary. It depends on all these different things that might affect your outcome on a very different day. And of course, your symptoms relate to where they are. I need to nip through some slides because I've been told I now have to stop. Health status is a big problem in diving. There is associated mortality with obesity. And aerobic fitness is obviously a key part of this, including any predisposing factors like PFOs and IPAVAs. We found that endothelial dysfunction is very common after diving. And I'm going to just show you very briefly that nitric oxide synthesis is certainly affected, and the innate immune response is going to be affected too. And we've also found that decompression sickness and the bubble formation is affected by exercise prior to a dive. So if you're going to have to take anything home, if you are fit and healthy and have a good endothelial function, you are less likely to generate bubbles on decompression and less likely to get decompression sickness. This is probably through nitric oxide synthase, and we all know that vascular health is related to nitric oxide synthase. I'm going to nip on because I'm going to get looked at. If you exercise during a dive, this is a very bad thing. Exercising at depth will increase the gas loading in your tissues. It'll increase the amount of dissolved gases and therefore increase the number of bubbles that need to then be released at the end of a dive. And this has been shown multiple times in the literature. Exercise during the compression phase, though, is rather like gently shaking a can of Coke before opening it. It just helps the bubbles come out a little bit. And so by the time you start to do your decompression phase, a lot of those bubbles have already found their way into the venous supply and been breathed out. If you exercise after decompression, this is a very bad thing. Please don't do it. It exacerbates bubble formation, rather like shaking your can of Coke vigorously and then opening it. So if we have to summarize this, there is increasing evidence that IPO, pulmonary edema, is a leading cause of injury and perhaps mortality in divers. Inert gases need to be managed very carefully. Anyone who's done diving training will know this. And that bubble formation on decompression is incredibly unpredictable and is affected by so many factors that I think the diving industry in the future is going to have to look very carefully at fitness and health when it comes to diving. And as I said, aerobic fitness, very important. So sorry for running over, but thank you very much.